The luminescent crystals embedded in Zirethal's translucent form pulsed with increasing frequency as she pressed her face against the observation window. Through the reinforced plasteel, she watched the last evacuation vessel shrink into a distant pinpoint of light among the stars. The crushing silence that followed felt surreal after the chaos of the emergency evacuation, a stark contrast to the usual bustling activity of the Cygnus mining outpost. Her crystalline hands trembled as she checked her status beacon again. The device's screen continued to flash the same error message that had sealed her fate mere minutes ago. Error. Signal interference. DETTT. Such a simple malfunction shouldn't have been possible with Centaurian technology, yet here she was, forgotten in humanity's furthest mining operation. The facility's emergency sirens suddenly screamed to life, their harsh wail echoing through empty corridors. Red warning lights bathed the metal walls in an ominous crimson glow. Zirethal's internal crystals resonated with the vibrations, a sensation her species had evolved to detect approaching danger. But she didn't need her biological early warning system to know what was coming. The swarm's approach had triggered the evacuation in the first place. Warning: hostile biological entities detected in Sector 7. All personnel proceed to emergency evacuation points immediately. The AI's calm voice seemed to mock her situation. There were no evacuation points left, no ships remaining in the hangar base, only empty corridors and the steadily increasing tremors in the station's outer walls. Zirethal forced herself to move, her crystalline form catching and refracting the emergency lights as she hurried through the station's main research wing. Her people were the acknowledged masters of space travel, pioneers of faster-than-light technology, creators of artificial worlds, and none of that mattered now. Their advanced bodies, perfect for processing complex calculations and storing vast amounts of data, were impossibly fragile compared to most other species. The research wing's terminal still displayed the data her team had been analyzing before the evacuation. Studies of human genetic adaptability, their seemingly impossible ability to survive conditions that would shatter a Centaurian. Her people had dismissed these traits as scientific anomalies, statistical impossibilities that deserved further study. Now, as she heard the first distant sounds of metal being torn apart, she wished she possessed even a fraction of that legendary human resilience. Zirethal reached the main laboratory, her crystals pulsing faster as she began barricading the entrance. She pushed tables against the doors, knowing they would provide little real protection against the swarm. Through the station's walls, she could feel the vibrations growing stronger. The swarm moved like a living wave, consuming everything in its path, breaking down matter at the molecular level to feed its endless hunger. A different rumble caught her attention, deeper, more mechanical. The station's defensive systems were activating. Massive shutters began sliding down over the external windows, sealing off sections of the facility. The process was automatic, designed to contain breaches and slow down invasive forces. Instead, it was trapping her in an ever-shrinking maze of corridors and rooms. Her communication crystal pulsed desperately, trying to establish a connection with any Centaurian ship that might still be in range. The signal bounced back, absorbed by the same interference that had doomed her minutes earlier. She had studied the phenomenon during her time at the outpost, a peculiar quirk of the local star's radiation that occasionally disrupted certain frequencies. Her team had meant to investigate it further next week. The lights flickered, and Zirethal's crystalline form cast fractured shadows across the laboratory walls. In the distance, the sounds of destruction grew louder. The swarm was getting closer, its countless drones tearing through the station's outer layers. Soon, they would reach the research wing. And then, a new sound cut through her spiraling thoughts, the sharp, rhythmic echo of boots on metal. Someone else was still in the station, moving with purpose, moving toward her location. But that was impossible. The evacuation had been complete, unless someone had stayed behind. Marcus Chen ejected the half-empty magazine from his pulse rifle, counting the remaining rounds with practiced efficiency. 12 shots. Against a swarm of thousands, it might as well have been nothing. He slammed his last full magazine into place, the weapon's power core humming to life with a familiar whine. The security office's monitors cast a pale blue glow across his scared face as he completed his final systems check. Most of the screens showed empty corridors now, a maze of abandoned research stations and processing plants. He'd watched the evacuation unfold through these same cameras, making sure every civilian made it to the ships. Standard operating procedure would have had him boarding the last vessel out, but Marcus had never been good at following procedures. A sudden alert flashed across his tactical display. His fingers flew across the holographic interface, pulling up the signal source. It wasn't the swarm. Their biomass disrupted electronics in a distinctly different way. This was a distress beacon, its signature partially masked by local interference. A Centaurian signature. "Well, shit," Marcus muttered, overlaying the signal's location with the station's layout. "Research Wing, Section C." His thermal scanners confirmed it. A crystalline form huddled in one of the laboratories, its heat signature a stark contrast to the surrounding equipment. Someone had been left behind. Through the cameras, he watched the Centaurian researcher attempting to barricade herself inside the lab. Her crystalline form trembled with each distant impact as the swarm tore through the station's outer layers. Marcus had worked with Centaurians before. Brilliant minds in impossibly fragile bodies. They could process complex equations in seconds, but shattered like glass under physical stress. The station's AI chimed another warning. Multiple hull breaches detected in sectors 3 through 6. Containment protocols engaged. Marcus checked the structural integrity readouts. The automated systems were sealing off sections of the station, trying to slow the swarm's advance. It would buy them maybe 10 minutes before the creatures found another way through. He'd planned to make his stand here in the security office, surrounded by weapons and tactical displays. A good position to thin out the swarm's numbers before they overwhelmed him. But plans change. They always did. Marcus grabbed his backup weapon, a heavily modified mining laser, and slung it across his back. The weapon had been declared too dangerous for civilian use by 3 different safety boards. He'd made it worse since then. As he moved toward the door, his gaze fell on the small metal disc sitting on the console, a tactical nuclear device, stripped from one of the mining charges. His last resort, meant to take out as much of the swarm as possible when they finally got him. Now it would have to wait. The corridors felt different with an actual rescue mission in mind. Marcus moved swiftly but cautiously, his boots silent despite his speed. Years of combat experience guided his path through the station's service tunnels and maintenance shafts, routes that didn't appear on any official maps. The swarm's impacts grew louder, accompanied by the screech of metal being torn apart at the molecular level. His neural implant buzzed, warning of elevated stress levels. Marcus ignored it. The implant had been complaining about his stress levels since the evacuation began. Standard human biology shouldn't be able to maintain this level of alertness for so long, but standard human biology had never been his strong suit. The research wing's main door was sealed, part of the containment protocol. Marcus accessed the emergency override, entering commands that would have taken a Centaurian several minutes to process. The massive door slid open with a hiss of hydraulics, revealing darkened corridors, lit only by emergency strips and the occasional spark from damaged systems. A crash echoed through the station, closer this time. Much closer. The swarm had breached another layer of defenses. Marcus checked his weapon's charge one last time and stepped through the doorway. Somewhere ahead, a crystalline alien was about to learn an important lesson about humanity. Sometimes the real monsters were the ones you wanted on your side. Zirethal's crystalline sensors detected the human before she saw him, a heat signature moving with impossible precision through the darkened corridor. Her initial relief at not being alone quickly shifted to confusion. The evacuation protocols were absolute. No one should have remained behind, especially not a mere security contractor. The laboratory doors slid open with a hydraulic hiss. Marcus Chen entered in a controlled crouch, his weapon sweeping the room with practiced efficiency. In the crimson emergency lighting, Zirathul observed details her species had long documented about humans: the dense muscle structure, the redundant organs, the ability to function under extreme stress. But statistics and observations couldn't capture the fluid grace with which he moved, like a predator in its natural environment. "We need to move," Marcus said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to cut through her panic. The swarm breached Sector 4. "They'll be here in minutes." He was already moving toward her, checking sight lines and potential escape routes with quick glances. A violent tremor shook the station. The lights flickered, plunging them into darkness for several seconds. When the emergency power restored minimal illumination, Zirathul watched in fascination as Marcus's pupils dilated, adapting to the low light faster than her specialized optical crystals could recalibrate. "How?" she began, her crystalline voice harmonizing with the station's warning sirens. "The evacuation was complete. I monitored it myself before my beacon malfunctioned. Changed my mind." Marcus reached the barricaded door, moving heavy equipment with a strength that would have shattered a Centaurian's crystalline structure. "Figured someone might need backup. Looks like I was right." The station's ventilation system suddenly reversed, flooding the corridor outside with decontamination gas. Zirathul's internal filters triggered automatically, but she noticed Marcus didn't even seem to register the toxic chemicals. His lungs were processing the harmful compounds more efficiently than her engineered filtration system. Another impact rocked the station. Closer this time. Much closer. "How are you planning to survive?" Zirathul asked, following him through the cleared doorway. "The swarm's biological mass exceeds the station's defensive capabilities by several orders of magnitude. The statistical probability of survival is..." "Statistics are for people with options," Marcus cut her off, checking his weapons charge. "We're working with what we've got." He pointed down the corridor. "There's a maintenance shaft 20 meters ahead. Leads to the secondary control room. Not on any official maps, so the swarm's movement patterns might miss it." A piercing shriek of tearing metal interrupted them. Through the station's walls, Zirathul felt the distinctive vibration of the swarm's approach. Her crystalline form resonated with the frequency, threatening to shatter. But before the harmonics could reach dangerous levels, Marcus pulled her into an alcove, his body somehow shielding her from the worst of the vibrations. "Their leading edge uses sonic pulses to weaken structural integrity," he explained, adjusting something on his weapon. "Found that out the hard way on Proxima 7. They're smart, but they're predictable. Always hit the same way. Never adapt their tactics." Zirathul processed this information with growing amazement. Her people had classified humans as an emerging species, barely worth studying except as an anthropological curiosity. Yet here was Marcus, casually revealing tactical insights about the swarm that her own species had failed to document in centuries of observation. The corridor ahead suddenly filled with movement, a wave of biomass flowing like liquid metal, consuming everything in its path. Marcus pushed her behind him, his weapon already firing. Each shot was precisely placed, targeting junction points in the swarm's collective mass that her sensors hadn't even identified yet. "Remember what I said about the maintenance shaft?" Marcus backed up slowly, maintaining a steady rate of fire. Now would be a good time to find it. In that moment, watching him hold back a tide of cosmic horror with nothing but outdated human weapons and impossible determination, Zirathul began to understand why her people's dismissal of humanity had been their greatest mistake. They had confused simplicity with adaptability and survival with evolution. The maintenance shaft was barely wide enough for Marcus to squeeze through, its walls lined with pulsing power conduits and data cables. For Zirathul's more slender crystalline form, the space was manageable, but she found herself struggling to match the human's pace through the cramped passage. "Wait," she called out, her crystals catching the dim emergency lighting. "There's something wrong with the atmospheric readings ahead." Her sensors detected a pocket of superheated air gathering in the shaft's next junction. Marcus didn't slow down. Instead, he pulled a piece of mining equipment from his belt, a simple thermal regulator designed to cool drill bits. "Wrong is relative," he said, making adjustments to the device that violated at least 6 safety protocols. "Sometimes wrong is exactly what we need." The junction ahead blazed with sudden heat as a portion of the swarm burned through the ceiling, molten metal dripping like rain. Before Zirathal could calculate an escape route, Marcus activated the modified regulator. The superheated air crystallized instantly, forming a barrier of ice that trapped several swarm drones in mid-descent. "That won't hold them for long," Marcus said, already moving again. "But it'll slow them down. They hate the cold. Disrupts their molecular bonds." "How did you know that would work?" Zirathal asked, following him through a maintenance hatch that wasn't on any of her station schematics. The thermal regulator wasn't designed to. "Everything's a weapon if you're creative enough." Marcus paused at another junction, checking sightlines. "Humanity's first tools were just rocks we picked up. Everything since then has been improvisation." They emerged into a secondary control room filled with mining equipment and atmospheric processors. Marcus immediately began gathering supplies, his movements precise despite the chaos echoing through the station's walls. Zirathal watched as he converted industrial cutting tools into makeshift weapons, her crystalline mind struggling to process the intuitive leaps in his logic. "These plasma cutters," she said, picking up one of the tools he'd modified. "You've reversed the containment field to create a directional burst, but the energy requirements would overload the power cell in about 3 shots. Marcus finished, handing her another modified cutter. "But 3 shots is better than none. Here's how you use it." The next few minutes were a crash course in human combat improvisation. Marcus showed her how to use the plasma cutter as a short-range weapon, how to create barriers using coolant tanks, how to turn simple mining charges into sophisticated traps. Each lesson violated countless safety regulations and engineering principles, yet they worked with brutal efficiency. A massive impact shook the station, closer than ever. Through the walls, they heard the swarm's collective scream, a sound that should have shattered Zirathal's crystalline form. But something had changed. The human's presence, his impossible confidence in the face of certain death, seemed to steady her. "They're trying to hurt us," Marcus said, checking the station's structural readouts. "Cutting off escape routes, forcing us toward the central processing hub. Smart move. Lots of biomass for them to consume there." "Then we should avoid it," Zirathal replied, her scientific training emphasizing the logical course of action. "Find another route to." "Nope." Marcus grinned, an expression that seemed entirely inappropriate for their situation. "We're going exactly where they want us to go, but we're going to make them work for it." Before she could protest, he was already moving. Zirathal followed, clutching her modified plasma cutter. She'd studied humans extensively during her time at the outpost, documenting their biological adaptations and social patterns. But nothing in her research had prepared her for this. The way Marcus turned retreat into advance, weakness into strength, certain death into possible survival. As they'd made their way through the station's broken corridors, setting traps and creating chaos, Zirathal began to understand a fundamental truth about humans. They didn't just survive against impossible odds. They thrived on them. The central processing hub was a cathedral of industrial might, its ceiling lost in darkness far above. Massive refinement tanks lined the walls, their contents still bubbling with molten ore despite the evacuation protocols. Marcus led them onto a maintenance catwalk that creaked under their weight, the metal worn thin by years of corrosive atmosphere. "The structural integrity of these walkways is compromised," Zirathal warned, her sensors detecting multiple stress fractures in the support beams. "They won't hold against any significant." The swarm burst through the wall behind them, a tide of writhing biomass that moved with singular purpose. Marcus spun, shoving Zirathal behind him as the first wave of drones launched themselves at the catwalk. His modified plasma cutter roared to life, each burst carving burning channels through the swarm's collective mass. But there were too many. The catwalk shuddered under the assault, its supports groaning with metallic protest. A drone slipped through Marcus's defense, its crystalline claws aimed at Zirithal's fragile form. She raised her own weapon, but knew she wouldn't be fast enough. Marcus moved without hesitation. He intercepted the drone with his body, letting its claws tear into his flesh, rather than shatter her crystalline structure. Blood sprayed across the catwalk as the drone's talons ripped through muscle and bone. Zirithal's scientific mind catalogued the damage automatically. Severed arteries, punctured lung, massive trauma that would kill any living being in minutes. But Marcus didn't fall. He grabbed the drone with his injured arm, using its own momentum to throw it into an ore tank. The creature's scream was cut short as it dissolved in the molten metal. "Your injuries," Zirithal began, her sensors showing impossible readings. The blood loss alone showed. "Had worse." Marcus's voice was strained but steady as he fired another burst into the advancing swarm. His body was already adapting. Blood vessels constricting to reduce loss, heart rate increasing to maintain oxygen flow, damaged muscles knitting themselves back together through sheer biological stubbornness. The catwalk gave way with a screech of tortured metal. As they fell, Marcus grabbed a hanging power conduit with his mangled arm, catching Zirithal with his other hand. The impact should have torn his arm from its socket, but somehow he held on, muscles straining against physics itself. They swung toward another walkway as the swarm pursued, its collective mass flowing like liquid death across the hub's walls. Marcus's wounds left a trail of blood droplets in the air, yet his grip never wavered. He timed their momentum perfectly, releasing the cable at exactly the right moment to land them safely on the lower level. "Your species," Zirithal said as they ran, watching Marcus's wounds continue their impossible healing. "We classified you as primitives because your biology seemed so simple, but it's not simple at all, is it? It's adaptable, resilient beyond any rational explanation." Marcus laughed, the sound rough with pain but unwavering. "Humans are too stupid to know when we're supposed to die. Making the impossible possible is kind of our thing." He checked his weapon's charge, ignoring the way his torn muscles screamed in protest. "Speaking of impossible, how are your sensors at detecting molecular instabilities?" Zirithal's crystals pulsed as she processed the question. "My sensors are calibrated to detect even the smallest atomic fluctuations." "But why?" "Because I've got a really bad idea," Marcus said, his grin visible even in the dim emergency lighting. "And I'm going to need your help to make it work." The swarm was regrouping, its mass coalescing into something larger, more focused. Through the station's trembling walls, Zirithal felt the approach of even more drones, drawn by the conflict. They were surrounded, outnumbered, facing enemies that had consumed entire worlds. But as she watched Marcus check his weapons with steady hands, his grievous wounds already half healed, she understood why humans had survived every extinction-level event their world had thrown at them. They didn't just fight against death. They refused to acknowledge its authority over them at all. Above them, the swarm's biomass swirled like a living storm, testing the hub's defenses for weaknesses. Marcus led them to a control station, his movements still fluid despite injuries that should have left him crippled. Blood dripped from his healing wounds, marking their path across the metal floor. "The facility's core," he said, accessing the station's systems with quick, precise commands. "Your sensors, can they analyze its atomic structure, looking for any unusual patterns in the containment field?" Zirithal extended her awareness, her crystalline form resonating with the core's energy signature. Data flowed through her consciousness as she processed radiation levels, molecular bonds, quantum fluctuations. Then she saw it. "There's a cascading instability in the core's containment matrix," she said, her voice harmonizing with the station's warning sirens. "The swarm's attacks have created microfractures in the field generators. If the containment fails completely, the resulting reaction would." She stopped, realizing what Marcus was suggesting. "No," The radiation surge would be fatal to all organic matter within the blast radius. Even your biology couldn't survive that level of exposure. Marcus kept working at the console, bypassing safety protocols with practiced ease. How many planets has the swarm consumed? How many species have they wiped out? Sometimes, the only way to stop a monster is to become something worse. The radiation would kill you in seconds, Zirathil insisted. Your cellular structure would break down at the molecular level. There has to be another way. Already running the numbers through that fancy crystalline brain of yours, aren't you? Marcus's smile held no fear, only a strange sort of peace. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me there's a better solution with better odds. She couldn't. Her calculations were perfect, absolute. The swarm's hive mind operated through quantum entanglement, each drone connected to the collective consciousness. A radiation surge of sufficient magnitude would disrupt those connections, causing a chain reaction that would destroy the entire swarm. But the cost. The blast needs to be triggered manually, Marcus continued, pulling up the core's schematics. Automated systems are shot, and the swarm would adapt to any remote detonation. Has to be done from inside the containment chamber. He checked his weapons one last time. Need you to get to the emergency shelter on sublevel 3. Walls are thick enough to protect you from the radiation. You knew, Zirathil said, her crystals pulsing with sudden understanding. From the moment you stayed behind. You knew it might come to this. Marcus shrugged, the gesture somehow containing an entire philosophy of human existence. Always have a backup plan, preferably one that involves excessive property damage. He pulled a small device from his belt, a tactical nuclear charge stripped from mining equipment. Rigged this up before the evacuation. Figured I'd take out as many of them as I could when they finally got me. This is better, though. This ends them completely. The swarm sensed their intentions. Its mass surged forward, breaking through the hub's upper levels in a cascade of twisted metal and shattered glass. Marcus raised his weapon, but Zirathil moved faster. Her modified plasma cutter fired 3 precise bursts, targeting structural weak points her sensors had identified. A section of ceiling collapsed, temporarily blocking the swarm's advance. That was my last shot, she said, dropping the burnout weapon. The power cell is depleted. Nice shooting. Marcus's grin hadn't changed, even with death approaching from all sides. Didn't think you had it in you. Guess humans aren't the only ones who can adapt. He stepped toward the core access corridor, then paused. Hey, when you tell your people about this, make sure they understand something. Humans don't just die. We choose what our deaths mean. The swarm broke through the debris, its collective mass forming into crystalline spears that could pierce any defense. But Marcus was already moving, his injuries forgotten, his stride purposeful. As he ran toward the core, drawing the swarm's attention, Zirathil finally understood why humans had survived every catastrophe their world had thrown at them. They didn't just face death. They turned it into a weapon. The core access corridor stretched before Marcus like a tomb of steel and shadow. Emergency lighting cast alternating patterns of light and darkness across his path, each step bringing him closer to the containment chamber. Behind him, the swarm's collective mass flowed like a river of living mercury, drawn to his deliberate movement. Perfect. Let them focus on him. His neural implants screamed warnings about radiation levels, about failing organ systems, about the impossible strain he was putting on his already damaged body. Marcus ignored it all. The pain was just information now, something to be processed and discarded like spent ammunition. The first wave of drones launched themselves at him, their crystalline forms refracting emergency lights into deadly prisms. Marcus fired his last modified plasma cutter in a wide arc, the superheated energy turning 3 drones to ash. As the weapon's power cell died, he threw it into the mass of approaching creatures. The explosion bought him another few seconds. Your sacrifice is inefficient, a voice echoed through the corridor. Not sound, but something deeper, transmitted directly into his mind by the swarm's collective consciousness. Your species lacks the biomass to sustain us. We offer evolution, transcendence. Join us." Marcus laughed, the sound echoing off metal walls as he ran. "Thanks for the offer, but humans tried the whole hive mind thing. Didn't take. We're kind of attached to being individuals." He grabbed a power conduit from the wall, ripping it free with strength born of desperation. Electricity arced across the corridor, forcing part of the swarm back. Through the station's cameras, he caught glimpses of Zerethal making her way to the emergency shelter. Good. She was learning to move like a human now, using cover, watching sight lines, thinking in 3 dimensions. She'd make it. She had to. The containment chamber's massive door loomed ahead, its surface etched with radiation warnings in 12 different languages. Marcus slammed his authorization code into the access panel, overriding safety protocols that were trying to save his life. The door began to open with glacial slowness. Not slow enough for the swarm. Their mass surged forward, crystalline appendages forming into impossibly sharp blades. One caught Marcus in the leg, slicing through muscle and bone. He stumbled but didn't fall, using the momentum to roll through the half-open door. "Your species is flawed." The swarm's voice resonated in his skull. "Primitive. Limited by individual consciousness. We have consumed civilizations far greater than yours." "Yeah." Marcus pulled the nuclear charge from his belt, fingers dancing across its control surface. "Then how come you never learned the first rule of dealing with humans?" He slammed the door's emergency lock, trapping himself inside with the core. Never corner something that's already planning to die. The containment chamber hummed with lethal energy, its walls glowing with barely restrained power. Marcus limped toward the core's central pillar, his body already beginning to break down from radiation exposure. The swarm pushed against the door, their combined mass warping the reinforced metal. They were strong, but the door would hold long enough. "Your death will be meaningless," the swarm insisted as Marcus reached the core. "We will adapt, evolve, continue. See, that's your problem." Marcus connected the nuclear charge to the core's exposed systems, his fingers steady despite the radiation eating through his cells. "You think death is the end. Humans, we think it's just another tool." The door finally burst open. The swarm's mass filled the chamber like a wave of living darkness, their collective consciousness screaming triumph. But Marcus was smiling as his finger hovered over the detonator. In his last moments, as radiation consumed his body, and the swarm reached for him with countless crystalline claws, Marcus thought about Earth, about all the times humanity had faced extinction, and spat in its face, about how every time the universe had tried to kill them, they'd turned death itself into a weapon. "Hey," he said to the approaching swarm, his voice steady even as his body failed. "Want to see a human trick?" He pressed the detonator. And for one brilliant moment, Marcus' chin burned brighter than any star. 3 days after the Cygnus mining outpost's destruction, Zerethal stood before the Centaurian High Council, her crystalline form still bearing microfractures from her ordeal. The chamber's perfect acoustics carried her harmonics to every council member as she presented her findings. The physical evidence was undeniable. The swarm, a species that had consumed 12 civilizations and countless worlds, had been completely destroyed. Their quantum-entangled consciousness had been shattered by the radiation surge, creating a cascade effect that rippled through their entire collective. Not a single drone survived. "The human knew," Zerethal explained, her crystals pulsing with the memory. He understood that the swarm's greatest strength, their connected consciousness, could be turned into a weakness. He transformed a mining facility's core into a weapon that ended a galactic threat. A single human. One council member's crystals flashed with skepticism. "Our studies classified them as an emerging species. Primitive. Their technology is centuries behind ours. Their biology is simple, their social structures basic. How could one human accomplish what our entire defense fleet could not?" Zerethal projected her sensor recordings, filling the chamber with holographic images of her escape through the station. They watched Marcus fighting despite injuries that should have been fatal, adapting mining tools into weapons, turning retreat into tactical advantage. "We were wrong," she said, her voice resonating with conviction. "We mistook simplicity for adaptability. Their biology isn't primitive. It's resistant to almost everything that would shatter our crystalline forms. Their technology isn't crude. It's purposefully designed to be repurposed. Every tool they create can become a weapon. Every weakness can become a strength." She played the final recording from the station's security feeds. The council watched in silence as Marcus Chen walked into certain death with a smile, turning his own sacrifice into the swarm's extinction. The footage ended in a burst of radiation that overloaded the sensors. "The human told me to make sure we understood something," Zirathul continued. "Humans don't just die. They choose what their deaths mean. Marcus Chen chose to make his death mean our survival. Not just Centaurian survival, but the survival of every species the swarm would have consumed." The council chamber remained silent for long moments after her presentation ended. Finally, the High Speaker's crystals pulsed with formal acknowledgement. "Your recommendations, researcher Zirathul. We must completely revise our classification of humanity." She projected data showing human survival rates in impossible conditions, their adaptation to environments that should have killed them. They aren't emerging primitives. They're extinction survivors. Their entire evolution has been shaped by catastrophe. She showed images of Earth's history: ice ages, asteroid impacts, supervolcanoes, plagues. Every time their world tried to kill them, they grew stronger. They didn't just survive disasters. They learned from them, adapted to them, turned them into advantages. We dismissed them because they lacked our crystalline perfection, our technological advancement. But perfection is fragile. Adaptation is strength. The council's collective harmonics hummed with growing understanding as Zirathul reached the core of her argument. We should not study humans as primitives. We should study them as teachers. They possess something our species has never developed: the ability to face extinction and say no, the capability to stare into the abyss of absolute death and turn it into a weapon. She raised her hand, projecting one final image. Marcus Chen's service record photo, his smile somehow knowing even then what he might one day become. "A single human saved our species," she concluded. "Not with advanced technology or superior numbers, but with the one thing we never understood about them. Humans don't accept death. They use it. They turn it into a tool, a weapon, a shield for others. We call them primitive because they embrace death. We never realized that this makes them the most advanced species of all." The High Council's decision was unanimous. Humanity's classification was changed that day. They were no longer listed as an emerging species. They were classified as extinction's natural predators.